Hey everyone, Tactics here, and with a couple 4 weeks behind us already in Season 3, it's about time to take a look at some of the harder trash pulls currently in the dungeon pool and give you guys some tips and tricks to get them down safely. Similar to the boss video I did, which you can find linked down below or over on my channel, I talked with a lot of players both in my Discord and over on my Twitch channel to come up with a few different areas of trash mobs that people seem to be struggling. I believe we're covering 6 in this video, just kind of across the board. If I did miss one that you guys are struggling with as well, let me know down in the comments below. Otherwise, let's get started with a series of pulls upstairs in Throne of the Tides just before the first boss. We've got that massive, of course, patrol of dogs, as well as just the casters and the patrolling Ravager in this area. So coming in here, I think it's probably a good idea to separate both this 3 pull and a 5 pull behind it in pug groups because of the number of casters in these pulls, 2 here and 2 in the other one. Too many kicks, you're going to get overwhelmed in most pug groups. You can see here we're really using LOS to our advantage to bring these mobs away from the rest of the pack there, because it's very easy to social those mobs with this Ravager coming in, right, if you fight it in here. So by pulling back and by using this LOS, you get away from this Ravager. It becomes a lot safer. Now we are going to then run into this room and pull the Ravager with this caster pack. Note that it is possible to pull this Ravager with the 3-pack depending on where this patrol is. It's a little finicky though, because you have to wait basically until the mob is right here. If you pull it right here in the patrol, it'll come without socialing this pack. However, if you pull it like here or here, it'll social onto this vicious Snapdragon. So that is not ideal, because you probably don't want to pull all this together unless you're in a coordinated group. So that's a note. If you want to risk trying to pull that Ravager, you can. We're just going to pull it in with here. I believe we don't walk into the room fast enough because of those spitefuls, and this mob is going to frontal like the entire party, so be aware of that. Otherwise, very similar to the previous pull, you just want to try and stay on top of as many kicks as you possibly can here. You've got the extra damage from the Ravagers, so you want to be a bit spread, and then you have the Snapdragons as well. So let's talk about these dogs, because these guys hit very, very hard. Now the key here is kind of twofold. It's 1, mob control, and it's 2, bleed removals. Obviously, you're not going to necessarily have a ton of bleed removals depending on your comp. The big ones are, any kind of physical immunity. Things like Bubble or Bop can be put on other players. There are plenty of others as well. Things like Netherwalk don't actually count as a physical immunity, but you'll get the debuff, but you won't take the damage until Netherwalk is over. Things like Evasion will prevent the auto attacks from applying to you, so those kind of work. There's Dwarf, Racial. If you have any dwarfs in your group, this is a very, very good dungeon to be a dwarf. You can, of course, remove those bleeds if you get them. And finally, any kind of evoker bleed cleanse, that will also work here. So those are like the big kind of categories of how you can actually remove these bleeds. And the other thing to worry about is CCs and control to prevent those bleeds from being applied to you in the first place here. With a 2-pack of Snapdragons, we don't tend to use a lot of it, especially because immediately following this pull is that pull of like 6 or however many Snapdragons are in that pack. So we're not using a ton here. You can see we're just kind of letting them go out, and then we're just going to take them. Plus, they don't stack up super fast with only 2 of them in the pack. We have some like stuns, but they die relatively quickly, so it's not a big deal. The real issue is this big one, and how you pull this as a tank is going to be dependent on how many bleed clears you have. As a paladin, I have a lot because, of course, I'm a dwarf paladin, and I have bubble taunt, so I have 2 separate clears here. Most tanks are not going to have that many clears, so if you only have a single clear from, like, say, an evoker, or you have maybe you are a dwarf and you don't have an evoker, that kind of thing, what you can do is walk into that pull with your major defensives up. You're going to gain a few stacks initially before they actually fixate on anyone else. Then you can clear that bleed quickly, and then you can use your control spells to keep those guys locked down. Big things like knockbacks, things like AoE slows, things like Urzel's Vortex are huge actually, because it prevents them from actually jumping out onto your party members initially, which is very, very good. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to use my bubble because I have that cleanse. But again, where I bubble would be where you used any single bleed cleanse you have. So like right here, basically, I got up to 6 because they all autoed me. So that's where you would use your dwarf, your evoker, whatever. If you didn't have a bleed cleanse available to you, this is where you would pop your major defensive, or you'd already have your major defensive popped rather, and you'd want to make sure that it basically extends until these ravenous pursuits happen. And as you see now, the first one has started. These all are going to start shortly, and this is where you would start ripping your control. AoE stuns, a knockback like a Typhoon or a Blast Wave, any slows you can drop on the pack. Again, Ursul's is really good, that kind of thing. And the goal here is you just want to control these Snapdragons enough that they will die before they end up coming back to you, because they're relatively low health mobs, right? So boom, there's a meta stun. They're probably going to start their pursuit now. They're getting out of the meta stun. They're slowed by the Frost Mage in our group. Now they're starting to jump out. But you can see here, I only went back up to 3 stacks after that. So it's not really a huge deal. As a tank 3 is survivable. We did end up losing 1 player from the mage because these Snapdragons, they got CC'd a little too hard and they didn't even start their cast initially, so they jumped out very late. But we were still able to get through this mostly clean. So it's really all about the number of bleed clears you have and the amount of control you have, and you just kind of stack them all up on this pull specifically and try and kill those guys before they actually you run out of control and they end up stacking up your tank too high or fixating out on other players and killing them as well. So it's all about control really for this pull. We want to jump downstairs though, still in Throne of the Tide, and let's talk about the Gauntlet. All right, so Throne of the Tide's Gauntlet here. I'm just going to start from the beginning. Obviously, this pack is not really in the Gauntlet, but let's count it. The big thing with these hunters is to just make sure you try and face them such that their backs are in similar directions, because they will disengage. So you're going to see here, boom, 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 3 of them disengage, and they're all relatively close together. I could have been a little bit more to the left to make this hunter also disengage in that direction. Just, a thing to adjust, but not a huge deal. So note that for tanking. Otherwise here, the goal is to not get yourself too stacked up with the Unstable Corruption disease when the sentries are casting their big AoE. So you see in this pull, Swell is going to go off. Unfortunately, there are a few corruptions on pull here available. You don't want to try and AoE too hard. We're going to get a couple stacks here. It's not the end of the world, as you can see, but it's not ideal. We end up popping barrier because of this. This is always going to be the scariest one in my opinion, because you're going to get these stacks very early in the pull because of just the mob positioning. So this is the one I'd recommend using defensives initially on the first Swell. Otherwise, same deal. We're kicking the 2 Aquamages in, and I'm going to try and position shortly here such these hunters get knocked back in the same direction when they disengage. Not ideal. Could have done that better. But now you can see, because those Unstable Corruptions are gone, and because we're tanking this back at the stairs instead of on top of where they spawned, you're not going to pull any more Unstable Corruptions into this pull. So that means any Swell after the first one is not as dangerous. So again, another reason to use defensives on that first Swell. Now, we're going to kill these Unstable Corruptions here before moving forward, because there is another patrolling sentry, and we don't want to have that sentry pulled in with like 10 stacks, right? Look at all these Unstable Corruptions. 10 stacks going into a Swell, very, very bad. So you're going to see here, we're going to kill off all these corruptions. Not much to go here. And you see the patrol of that guy. So they're going to finish them off here. I'm going to pull them in. And you're going to see, oh, wow, you got a lot of stacks here. Luckily, again, look at the timer of the Swell. Look at the timer of this. I think we might eat a single tick maybe with this many stacks. They're gone. Okay, yeah. So you could have delayed an extra second than I did if you didn't want to cut it close. But you can see here, now we have a 0 stack for this Swell, and obviously that's going to come with corruptions when you actually pull the sentry. But you can see here, because based on their health, we're only going to kill 3 of them, I think, before the last couple ticks of this Swell. So it's not a ton of extra damage here. So that's perfectly fine. And the rest are going to die immediately after. And now again, this is going to expire before the next one actually starts casting. So again, you're not going to take any damage amp from this one. So again, the first one's a little bit more dangerous, but not nearly as dangerous as the very first one from the other sentry that I talked about. So still want to use defensives on that first sentry, first cast there. We could have been a little further back. If you would tank this mob back here, these corruptions wouldn't have run in. Not a big deal for us though, just because we're already up here and we kill the mob before the next Swell even happens. These ones, the only reason you would kill these guys is to reduce your target count if you have any target capped classes. There's no real reason to stop here because the next pack doesn't do any shadow damage. So not having a shadow damage hit on you is not really a big deal. Unless you're maybe a shadow priest trying to use Shadow Word Death. But coming in here, it's all about, again, control. This is a very, very long cast time, right? And so you're trying to stop as many of these casts as humanly possible. Interrupts, AoE stops, the mob will recast, right? You can't actually stop the cast. It's going to recast immediately, but because the cast is so long, it does a decent amount of work in mitigating damage here. So there's the AoE Fear coming out. I'm kicking as much as I can. Other people are kicking as well on cooldown. We've got single target stuns going out as much as possible. There's the AoE stun, right? This is another pack where it's all about control. Just like the dogs, any kind of control you can drop on this pack, interrupts, those kinds of things will make your life easier. One bolt going off isn't going to kill people usually. Sometimes if they're already low, it could. It's really if 2 bolts go off on the same person, then they're likely dead. So drop those control abilities here as well, similar to those dogs. After this, it's a double sentry pull. I just throw a marker out on one of them and we prio that one just to get it down at the faster, because for some reason these mobs will cast swell at the same time. They don't have that kind of like stagger technology where only one can cast at a time. So whenever these guys are overlapping, this is when you want to pop a defensive, right? So that's the defensive. You're not going to have stacks here because you're all the way to the edge here, so you're through the gauntlet at this point. But it's still very, very scary. And when the first one dies, it will spawn mobs. But again, usually, depending on the timing, it's not too big a deal. So like this one dies now, and it's not too big a deal. We're still focusing the sentry, and we're going to kill it first before these guys actually end up being scary for the swell. So that's kind of how that works. Pick one, focus it down, pop a defensive when they overlap their ability. That is Throne of the Tides. Let's go to Galakrond's fall around the second boss. So this kind of thing, how it works is you need to kill the 4 trash packs that are in front of the portal. So there's 4 of them. You need to kill all 4 of them to actually trigger the boss here. So the big thing is to try and not overlap Lieutenant Mob. So this is the beginning to the right. This guy patrols around this area, so we're going to grab him. He's a Lieutenant Mob, and the thing with the Lieutenant Mobs is that each of the Lieutenant Mobs will put out 2 magic debuffs. This guy is on 2 random targets. That's the big circles. It ticks, and it blows up at the end. You want to dispel that again just to reduce your damage. Of course, don't dispel it when they're on top of people, so it can be pre-spread a little bit if you're ranged here. We pull it to this portal because the mobs are about to jump out of it. Make sure you get your kicks, obviously, there. Mobs jump out here, and the key here is that these mobs do not have another big Lieutenant Mob in this pack. So that's why we tank this guy right up against this. We immediately pull it, but it doesn't pull in such a way that we have 2 of these guys in one pull. So that's the key here. Something to note with these intervals, they will always spawn if they are hit by a chrono burst. You can see here, these are the unspawned intervals. These are the ones we just hit with a chrono burst. They did spawn. So you can kind of pre-spread to an area that doesn't have intervals down if you're a ranged DPS or a healer. So keep that in mind. We could have avoided this, but you can see they're very scary because they're going to immediately melee that person, right? And that's why we drop very low there. So just be aware of that. But you saw our other chrono burst spread to over here, and there were no intervals over there. So that's the kind of pre-positioning I'm talking about. Luckily, there's no chrono burst in this pack either. And you can see again, I moved back to the left side, and the reason for that is to avoid pulling 2 of those Lieutenant Mobs that I mentioned in the same pull. So you're going to see again, as I move over, this guy, he patrols around the others, like this whole area up here. And if you come from the other direction we just went, so if you rotate around the room counterclockwise, then you're going to pull a pack that has another Chrono Burst guy up here, and this anomaly is 9 times out of 10 going to pat onto you during that pull. And that means you're going to have this guy who puts out 2 magic debuffs and the Chrono Burst guy who puts out 2 magic debuffs. And that is bad news on a fort key. So you see we're going to pull him in here. This guy does have a cone, so I'm going to pull him away. And then we can talk about Bloom for a second here. So this is a pretty nasty magic debuff that goes out. It goes out always on the tank, and then it goes out onto one other random player. What I recommend here you do as a healer with a magic dispel is you always dispel the non-tank player. The dot, of course, does scale, I believe, with the damage taken, so you can pre-defense this as a tank to kind of mitigate the power of that dot. But again, as a tank player, you're going to be used to that damage intake, so taking it and on yourself is not a big deal. Just be prepared for it. Also, dwarves doing work here. Again, very, very good area to be a dwarf because of all those magic debuffs going out. There's always 2 sets of 2. So you see here, I immediately dwarfed this off. It's gone, and that leaves the healer open to dispel the other person, which was themselves, actually. So they dispelled their... Actually, no, they diffused theirs even. So that actually left their dispel open entirely. So it's another option, right? Diffuse works. Any kind of immunity, again, will work here. The other thing tanks can actually do is because this debuff scales off the damage taken by the tank, if you 100% mitigate it, no debuff will actually go out. So that's things like Bubble, that's things like AMS. You can completely prevent the debuff from being applied at all. So things to note there, if you're one of those tank specs that can do that, which is very, very nice. Otherwise, again, focus on dispelling that random player because there's a very, very high chance they have worse damage mitigation than the tank, right? So other than that, make sure the bosses or the mini boss here is faced away, and you're going to see now instead, I'm going to move into this other pack, and this is the pack I was talking about, where this other mini boss, the Chrono Burst mini boss again, is in this pack. And if you had pulled this, the anomaly would have patrolled into you if you had come from the other direction. So that's why we kind of do the right pack with the one coalesce time guy, and then we kind of backtrack to clockwise around the room and go that way instead of continuing counterclockwise. So that's my one big tip here. The other thing to note as well, once you get through this pack, there's another anomaly pull over here because there's 2 anomalies and 2 of those Chrono Burst guys, is that these leeches around the room, like I mentioned, are not affected by the RP whatsoever. So once you kill these 4 portal packs, you technically are free to pull more of these leeches while the RP is happening, or even with the boss fight. You're going to see a lot of probably high-end groups do that, but obviously in a pug group, you don't need to do that whatsoever. Just something to note, an interesting little fact about these guys is that, you know, you're probably going to see a lot of these leeches get pulled in higher keys just because you can do them while nothing else is happening, right? You always want to be doing something during RP if you can help it, and this boss fight for a tank is not too scary, so you're going to see those probably get pulled on as a tank player as well. Now, let's move on here to the other Dawn of the Infinites here, and another Gauntlet. So we've got the Murozond Rise Gauntlet. Very, very fun. Of course, the count in this area, a little bit RNG, because these fusions do give count, and of course it's a gauntlet, so they're constantly going to be spawning in here, so be aware of that. Kind of know what percent numbers you want to be at with your given route. Otherwise here, you need to kill 4 of these Rift Mages to actually be able to trigger the RP to go to the next boss. This is going to be an example of us going towards Morchi first, as opposed to the Time Lost Battlefield, so keep that in mind for this rotation, but you could do the same thing on the opposite side, so keep that in mind. We're going to pull this Rift Mage in. These guys will walk a decent distance before they start their first cast, so you don't necessarily need a range kick on them unless you're pulling them from very far away, so keep that in mind. But having a range kick saved for the first kick of a Rift Mage is a nice thing to have, which is what we do here. We do a decent first pull in this area with a Rift Mage and an Anomaly, again, from one we just covered. Exact same abilities, just at 50% health because of this explosion debuff, so keep that in mind. And we are going to prioritize kicking the Rift Mage here, something else really to kick. Infinite Burn is a magic debuff on a random player. That's the big one. The other thing is just tank damage, so if your tank is fine, it's not too important to get those kicks. Prioritize the Infinite Burn, especially if you have multiple mages at the same time, which you can do in more coordinated groups, but a lot of pug groups, you're going to stick to one mage at a time. And you see here, we're just slowly working our way around the room, and slow is key here. Do not pull too many of these guys at once. The explosion damage has been nerfed recently, but it's still quite scary if you end up killing like 6 of these guys at once. Not to mention the tank damage, again, was nerfed from these guys, but still, if you have like 6 to 8 of these in a pull and a Rift Mage, and you're not kicking all the Rift Mage abilities, your tank is going to get absolutely blasted. So make sure you are careful with the amount of mobs you are pulling in this area. With, again, usually only one Rift Mage in a lot of pug groups. That's the kind of norm there. Again, we're getting the range kick to get him in. As you see, I'm just basically clearing the way to the Morchi portal, because that's where we want to end up going. You do not actually need to clear around the whole room. What you can actually do is you can have people kind of dip into the sand a little bit and tag these guys on the far end. You're going to see our priest here. He's going to pop a personal on himself. He's going to go get that guy and come back out, get rescued out. And again, this may be a more coordinated group thing, but just a note, it can happen. And now we have a range kick to get this guy in. Oh, he's going to blast the priest first. There we go. Got the kick on it. And now we're getting this guy in from the opposite side now, right? So this is something you can do. And what this does is it just saves you from having to spend an extra minute, you know, in this area clearing all the way over here to these mobs. So that's the bit of useful things. You can pull these Rift Mages to you. We're going to do the same thing with the other Rift Mage here. Again, be careful whenever you pull an anomaly. There are 2 anomalies in this area. One's right here at the front, and one patrols right down the middle of the room here, so that's how we got this guy. And other than that, once you kill the 4th Rift Mage, you do need someone to kind of go, again, with a Morchi route, near the other gate to actually trigger the RP here. And I can actually fast forward that a little bit to show you what this looks like. Should be here. Yeah, so I just touched the gate, basically. Touch the safe area right over here by the end of the sand. And this triggers the RP, which allows the gate to open. We do end up pulling these deviations. But again, you can, if you're in a pug group, just always clear a little bit further towards this direction. If you don't want to do this, just a neat little tech, which can save you a little bit of time in this area, especially if you're already kind of going slow and steady to kind of open up these gates without having to clear the entire room. One other thing actually to mention, tanks, be careful again. The sand hurts, right? The sand is quite painful to stand in. So if you're tanking a bunch of mobs and obviously you want to be near the sand to clear your path, don't stand in the sand too much, because there's what the sand looks like without much of a personal pop. It hurts. It hurts a lot. So if you can help it, do not dip your toe in the sand. It's going to drastically increase your tank damage, and you're going to be like dying out of nowhere and be like, how did I die? You probably stood in the sand. So keep that in mind. But that is Murozond's Rise. Next, we're going to talk about a couple different areas in the Everbloom. So Everbloom is another pretty deadly trash dungeon for a lot of different players. I think mostly tanks and ranged players that you're seeing struggle with this this dungeon. I'm going to talk about two different areas. The first is the area before Ancient Protectors, though a lot of this applies to the first area as well, with the Dread Petals, the Berserkers, and the Abominations. And then after that, I'll talk about the mages before the third boss. All right, so let's get into it here. First things first, the Dread Petals. This thing on above them means that they're going to apply a debuff on their auto attacks, and this is a all damage taken amp. So this stacking up on me is an all damage taken amp. It is a slow, so things that can clear those slows will also allow you to clear that damage amp. And tanks, this is very, very important, especially with all the other damage happening in this pack. If you have a massive damage amp on you on a fort week, it's going to be very, very bad. And because there's so many Dread Petals and all these pulls, it's going to stack up very quickly. Things like Freedom, things like Tiger's Lust, Avatar, I believe Vengeful Retreat as well. There's a lot of abilities that can clear your stacks. So you want to make sure, one, you have those talented, and two, you're watching your stacks and clearing when needed here, just so you don't get too high. Obviously, immunities as well can be useful. Oops, sorry. And that's the big thing here. You want to make sure you don't get, so I Freedom there as I'm getting over 10 stacks to prevent any more debuffs. And the big thing too, with the Abomination, who's going to be slamming you with that poison hit, is going to be quite dangerous if you're very high stack, so be aware of that, as well as the AoE from their Noxious ability as well. So tanks, be aware. Also get that poison spell as quick as you can, because it does hurt a fair bit on top of all the other damage as well. Speaking of their actual AoE there, something that maybe players don't know is you can actually avoid the AoE by using a combat drop. So a combat drop immediately before the AoE goes out will actually prevent it from applying to you. Similar to the Drakes in Vortex Pinnacle, if you guys remember from last season. So things like Vanish, Feign Death, Shadow Meld, and Invis will all allow you, just before the cast goes off, to actually prevent that ability from applying to you, the Noxious Disruption. So you do it like now. Boom, and it wouldn't go out on you. And actually, you can see here, the Rogue actually took no damage. So he did that. He vanished, I believe. I think, maybe. We'll see. But that's kind of the tip there for those guys to help your healer a little bit. You know, make sure they don't get too overwhelmed with the damage going out. You can do that. Otherwise, Personal is really, really good on those A-bomb hits. Now, Melded Berserkers, Bounding Whirl. As you can see here, it's quite a scary ability here. It's always going to jump to a ranged player. I do not believe it jumps to the furthest ranged player. You're going to see some examples here of where they jump out. There's one going there. There's a player behind them, I believe. Yeah, there's another player behind them, and you're going to see more jumps of these Berserkers in this clip. Goes to that person, goes to that person who's clearly not the furthest away. This person's clearly further, that kind of deal, right? So it's clearly jumping to ranged targets. It is not jumping to the furthest available target every time. So it just jumps to a random ranged player. So you need to be ready, watching their cooldowns. Nameplates on cooldown. The old Relo Weakwear, which is now maintained by Mira's, very, very good here. That's what's telling me their cooldown on the thing. Right there, boom. Now this guy's going to jump. See, very, very useful. You can stop these jumps mid-air, just like in Noku Defensive. You guys remember that, the leaps mid-air. So stuns, AoE disorients, AoE fears, that kind of thing while they're in the air. Can stop them. Ursul's Vortex can stop them. The other interesting thing, which may not be intended, it may be a bug, but what you can do is you can watch this cooldown. See, it's 4 seconds here. And if you use a stun, where the stun lasts through this cooldown, through this ability getting off cooldown, it will actually go on cooldown. So it will be used during the stun for some reason, and it will go on cooldown again. So you can use stuns or other CCs like that just before, so like now would be a good time to like kidney shot this mob, for example, and if it lasted through this 2-second duration, it would come off cooldown, the mob would try and cast it while they're stunned, it would fail, and it would go on cooldown again. So that is something, that is how this ability is functioning. We found this could be fixed at any moment, so be careful. I don't know if this is intended, I assume it's not. Most mobs don't work this way, though a couple mobs this season do, so just be aware of that. That could help you if you don't have access to a lot of great stops. Otherwise, range, you just need to play with enough distance that you have time to react to those mobs jumping out at you. And of course, watch those cooldown timers, because if you get caught unprepared with a couple of those mobs in the pack, they just jump out you eat a couple ticks, you are going to die. Now, let us move to those casters at the end here before Archmage Soul. Here we go. All right, so everyone's favorite pull here, the triple caster pull. Now, the priority is always going to be the Pyromancer. You always want to get kicks on the Pyromancer. Pyroblast hits the hardest, so you want to make sure that is kicked, because it could very, very easily one-shot players. The Ice Caller and the Arcanomancer, I believe their abilities deal the same damage now. I believe Arcane used to hit harder, but it got nerfed. So they do the same damage, but Frost slows. So your secondary kicks are going into the Frost, or the Ice Caller rather, and if you have to let kicks go off, right, your heavy range group, or you just don't have a prop paladin or whatever, you let the arcane kicks go off, because usually players can survive this. If you get into higher fortified keys and you're letting the arcane kicks go off, the target likely needs to personal, so keep that in mind. But you're going to see here, we're going to group them up, and we're going to dump all of our damage initially into the Pyromancer. We're hard focusing this Pyromancer down, and what that does is it gets rid of the Cinderbolt Salvo, which is kind of the wombo combo. If someone takes an arcane hit with a Cinderbolt Salvo going out, that's another kill condition for a player. So again, you really want to personal that. And it just removes a kick as well, so you can start shifting your high priority kicks to the Ice Caller and your spare kicks to the Arcanomancer. So that's the key here, and why we're focusing the Pyromancer. And you see here, as a prop paladin, I can help get a lot of other kicks, and that is why we're not letting kicks go off very often here. You're not necessarily going to have a prop paladin, right? Prop paladin really shines in this dungeon, like I mentioned, the freedom earlier, the kicks on this pack in particular, but not every group is going to have a prop paladin, and so you need to make sure that you are prioritizing kicks on the Pyromancer first and foremost, and the Ice Caller secondarily. And then once the Pyromancer gets kicked, then you can start making sure that you kick both the Arcanomancer and the Ice Caller. But otherwise, again, as long as you are kicking the Pyromancer and the Arcanomancer and the Ice Caller are not targeting the same person, you should be fine up into the low 20s on Fortified Week. But there it is, guys. That is some of the hardest trash pulls in Season 3 of Dragonflight, and how I recommend you actually handle them. Hopefully, both this video and my hardest bosses video, which actually covered Archmage Soul, helped you guys out, helped you guys get those keys timed. And if they did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like them, including part 2 of that hardest bosses video. Got a lot of recommendations there, so I'll be putting out a part 2 in the next couple days. If you have any questions about any of the trash packs that we covered in this video, or maybe some other ones that I didn't cover that you are struggling with, please drop those down in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer. Plus, also, make sure you come stop by my Twitch channel at Tactics, say hi there, ask any questions there as well. Of course, I have to thank my fantastic Patreon supporters for helping me continue to make all this content for you guys, so thank you. Otherwise, thanks everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.